Well, today our team went to the Undrupinar border crossing. That is a Turkish border crossing with Syria. It's about 50 kilometers from where I am right now in the city of Gaziantep. On the other side of the border, of course, is Syria and the province of Aleppo. That's where many Syrians who are registered as refugees here in Turkey are from. We saw many refugees today waiting for hours to get those authorizations that would allow them to go back into Syria. We spoke to one refugee who hadn't seen his parents, he told us, in 12 years. He had fled to the Syrian city of Homs, where he first spent 3 years before. He then fled across the border into Turkey. And the reason he fled, he told us, was because his parents told him to. They were frightened that he would be forced to serve, that he would be conscripted in the Syrian government forces. He also lost two brothers who had become rebel fighters who had joined the Free Syrian Army. That rebel outfit later renamed the Syrian National Army. We also spoke to a father and son, the father who was ecstatic to be able to take his son back to Syria, because when they first fled, he told us his son was only 3 years old, so his son has no memory of what Syria looks like. So this will be the first time his son really discovers his homeland.
Yeah, that's quite exciting news for that person. Andrew, we've heard from the Turkish authorities that they're going to try and increase the number of migrant crossings now that Assad has fallen and people are going to be looking to go home. But what's the reality there on the ground?
Yeah, so in Turkey, there are roughly 3.2 million Syrians who are officially registered as refugees here. The actual number of Syrian refugees living in Turkey might be closer to 4 million, however. Now, many of them live in camps, others live with relatives and friends in cities across Turkey. Now, the Turkish government has said that it is indeed beefing up its border facilities to be able to handle up to 20,000 crossings per day. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also recently announced that he would open another border crossing, Yarlıdere, that's in the province of Hatay to the west of here, to ease the return of those Syrian refugees. Of course, it's no secret that Turkey's president wants many refugees to return home. But the reality is not everyone wants to go home. I've spoken to refugees who live now in cities like Istanbul, some of whom have been living in Turkey for more than a decade, who've made themselves a new life here. So many of those people don't want to go back to Syria straight away. Other people, of course, waiting to see how the situation unfolds, whether or not the security situation really does stabilize in the long run before making that decision to go back to Syria.
Andrew, great to get that update there. That's Andrew Hilliar, France 24's reporter, standing by for us on Turkey's southern border. Well, as we've been mentioning, attention is turning to what's next for the millions of Syrian refugees spread out across the world. Here in Europe, there are growing calls for those who fled the civil war to begin returning home, with a number of nations announcing Monday that they are suspending asylum requests for Syrians. Among those countries are France, Austria and Germany. Germany is home to 1 million Syrians and has the highest number of Syrian asylum seekers in the continent. Well, we're going to cross over to Germany now and speak to Susan Fratzke, who is a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute's International Program. It's great to have you on the program, Susan. Thanks so much for joining us. So you're in Berlin, and we've, of course, seen the far-right AfD party, politicians from that party saying that those who've been celebrating the downfall of Assad, Syrians that have been celebrating the downfall of Assad, should be returning home now because, by all accounts, they have nothing to fear for. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think the best way to approach the situation at the moment is really to wait and see what happens. We aren't in a position yet with the Syria government itself to really have a firm sense of who will end up controlling all of the territory, what the power sharing arrangements will be, and in fact, if this really is the end of the active conflict. So I think we need to wait and see what happens on the ground. And even if, hopefully, the active conflict is finished and we'll see a more stable regime coming out of Syria, it will take a long time for the country itself to rebuild, for there to be sufficient economic opportunities, and for people to really have sufficient access to services, be able to rebuild their homes and their lives. So it's really quite soon to be making any pronouncements or suggestions that the large number of refugees in Germany at the moment begin to plan their return to Syria.
Well, Austria may be a bit more premature because it's saying that it's going to start deporting Syrian migrants in their country. Tell us about the fact, what sort of precedents this is going to set if people are already, or authorities are already planning to deport migrants back to countries where we don't even know what the future is going to hold and whether it's going to be safe for them to return.
Well, Austria is getting obviously a bit ahead of itself. I think it's important to look at the specifics of the announcement. At the moment, what the government has said is that they have asked to prepare a return plan for Syrians, which means that they are looking at the situation and evaluating whether or not they could plan to end refugee status and other forms of protection for Syrians and then begin to encourage people to return home. That doesn't mean that they will immediately begin to deport people. Hopefully what will happen is they will conduct a review, determine that more information is needed, and begin to encourage people, provide support for them to return, reintegration packages, these sorts of things. But certainly any decision to begin to end refugee status at this point and force people to return home would be very premature and likely against international law.
And Susan, a lot of analysts are suggesting that the reason why European countries are taking this step to suspend asylum seeker requests for Syrians is because they are worried about a repeat of the crisis that we saw in 2015, where we had millions of Syrians coming to Europe. Tell us whether you see a situation like that repeating itself in the aftermath of Assad's fall.
Well, I think, again, we'll have to see how the situation evolves. There are certainly a lot of fears, of course, that if the new government that has come in doesn't manage to maintain control of the country and consolidate power, that you could end up in a situation with various factions vying for control that could end up displacing more people. In that situation, of course, it would be the countries neighboring Syria that would see the biggest impact. Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon host the majority of Syrians, though of course there are quite a large number of people who have found protection in Europe, particularly Germany as well. I think, though, that the political situation in Europe in the moment is such that European countries, if something like that were to emerge again, pressures like that were to emerge again, they would likely take much more drastic action. And would likely respond quite quickly by trying to find many different ways to stop people from arriving in Europe, some of which may not be or may push the boundaries of legality.
And Susan, let's stay with the potential of a repeat of 2015 happening again. Those critical of the crisis say that it cost Europe millions and it was massive fiscal challenge for Europe. Economically, can Europe afford to have a repeat of 2015?
Well, it's quite difficult to put a specific price tag on something like the 2015 and 2016 migration crisis, because many of those individuals who arrived have now integrated into the labor market. They're paying taxes, contributing, beginning to fill labor force gaps that European countries are facing that are quite critical. So it's quite difficult to calculate the actual cost of that situation in particular. That being said, of course, there are costs that a situation like that imposes, including on asylum systems and integration supports and these sorts of things. I think the bigger challenge, though, that 2015 and 2016 created for Europe was the political crisis that it caused. We often see when a situation like that emerges that publics are very supportive and generous within the first few months or even year or two, and then that support begins to fade as the crisis continues. And I think we've seen that in Europe, that as irregular and mixed migration has continued along many of the same routes in Europe, publics have become much less tolerant of continued arrivals of asylum seekers. And the cost that I would be particularly concerned about if there was a reemergence of a similar situation at Europe's borders would be the political costs. I think we also have to acknowledge, though, of course, that there are additional budgetary and economic constraints that Europe is under right now as European countries face pressure to increase their defense spending. Several countries are entering or facing recessions at the moment. So that both decreases the political space for countries to respond in a really creative way, and of course also creates additional financial constraints as well.
Susan, great to get your insight. Thanks so much for joining us on Prime News Paris. We really appreciate your time. That's Susan Fratzke, who is a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute's international program, speaking to us there. We're going to go to Israel now.